Well, another week, another Bud Light story. This week's recipe for disaster is one part gaslighting, one part media manipulation. Mix it all together, and you get some pretty disastrous results for the company, but some interesting bright spots for employees that are impacted by the shenanigans that surprisingly, not a lot of publications are covering. Let's check it out. Hey folks, Mark here with The Rational Workforce. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate you stopping by. And if you've been following this channel for any amount of time at all, or just generally aware of what's been happening in the news and in pop culture, you have absolutely heard about what's going on with Bud Light. We're not going to do a dramatic recap on the whole saga. I'm getting kind of sick of hearing about it. But again, this channel is all about talking about how the news, how the media, how current events impacts workers in the workforce. And actually today's story is going to end with a little bit of a positive note on some of the folks that have been impacted by the demise of the brand and have experienced some layoffs. We'll show you just how deep those cuts have been. But as I was doing a little bit of research for this story, man, it's just absolutely fascinating to see how this story has been teed up in the media. And, there are pretty significant chunks of what's going on that have been left out and just really stretching the truth in a lot of different cases. So don't want to lead the witness. I'm going to let you decide, but let's jump into it and take a look. So this first article we have is from Entrepreneur Magazine. And at the time of this recording, it was just a few weeks ago. And take a look at the headline. Angry customers boycotting Bud Light, having meaningfully impacted sales, said the Anheuser-Busch CEO. And it goes on to describe that, look, AB InBev is a massive global business. They've got scores and scores and scores and scores of brands around the globe. So it's conceivable, right, that a dip in a brand in one of their geographies in the big picture of AB InBev isn't probably as pronounced as one may think, right? So the AB InBev CEO, Michael Doukeris, addressed the controversy's impact on an earnings call, saying that although he didn't want to minimize it, the dip in Bud Light's U.S. sales during the first few weeks of April accounted for just 1% of the company's total global volumes for that period. And again, probably not that far off base, but just look at the way it's teed up in the headline alone. Angry customers boycotting Bud Light, having meaningfully impacted sales. All right, so there's a big difference between meaningfully impacted the overall profitability of the company versus impacting overall sales. I think that it's objectively disputable that the sales drop-off has been pretty dramatic. And in fact, we fast forward a couple of weeks and we've got this story that really reinforces that, right? So this is from August 3rd, so a couple weeks after the first one that we looked at. Fall in Bud Light sales puts a dent in the beer maker's earnings. AB InBev is struggling in the U.S. after the conservative-led boycott of Bud Light. Conservatives aren't the only one boycotting it. Bud Light kind of left members of the LGBTQ community out in the cold when they decided to completely walk away from Mulvaney, but without actually addressing it properly. Story for another day. Leaving other brands in the company's portfolio to pick up the slack. So let's take a look at how steep this was. AB said its revenue in the U.S. last quarter fell more than 10% from a year earlier, primarily due to the volume decline of Bud Light. An operating profit at the U.S. unit dropped nearly 30%. Folks, the amount of money that the U.S. division of AB brings in is staggering. And for a 30% drop, that's significant. That's not meaningfully impacting sales, right? There's some there. They go on and they rehash the story. They talk about specifically how this whole thing was rooted in Dylan Mulvaney. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's look at some of the other stats. If you scroll down here, retail sales of Bud Light fell as much as 42% in some U.S. metro areas in the 4 weeks that ended on July 22nd. And customers at bars and restaurants have also ordered Bud Light less frequently, sending sales down 34% last quarter, according to data from Union, an ordering system used at more than 1,000 bars and restaurants in 34 states. So Not exactly the rosy picture that the original article from a few weeks ago painted, right? There is absolutely a meaningful, substantial, ouch, this hurts impact in sales for AB. But let's talk about a couple of the other pieces that the article mentions. One, I already referenced, right, that this was all conservative led. I think conservative led is probably the right way to put it. But again, if you kind of look into it, there were more than just conservative groups, more than just individual consumers that were pushing back on this, right? There are other communities that by Bud Light waffling have impacted, and that touched their sales too. But to tee this all up just under what they were trying to do with Dylan Mulvaney and the cans with her image on it and all that fun stuff, it actually goes a little bit beyond that, and I'm not seeing a lot of media outlets that are actually covering this. So if you recall, this is Alyssa Heinerscheid. So she is the VP of marketing who was in charge of the Bud Light brand when all of this went down. And just a week or two before the whole Mulvaney thing blew up, she had given this interview that then later surfaced. And I'm going to play a little clip of it for you right now. And you tell me if you think this sounds like someone who actually values and respects the customer base she already has.
Bud Light had been kind of a brand of bratty, kind of out of touch humor, and it was really important that we had another approach.
All right, so fratty, out of touch. If this has been your brand, or maybe it has been your brand since college, and you were actually, drinking this in your frat house, who cares? Like, when you're a consumer of a brand that you've loved, describes you as fratty and out of touch, then they go in a radically different direction. Like, look, I've been a marketing CMO. I understand there are some times you just need to evolve your brand, but you need to do so in a way that doesn't insult your existing client base and certainly doesn't leave them behind. And a brand with as much pull and power as Bud Light could have done something a little differently, a lot differently, where they built a bridge between those two worlds and used their brand in a way that was more positive and less kind of draconian, where they made that hard cut. So, the long and the short of it is they made some bad decisions, and they're paying the price for it, but they're trying to point blame everywhere else but themselves. There has never been an apology. There's never been a formal statement of like, hey, look, we effed up. They've tap danced around it, but they haven't come out and specifically said it. And now let's take a look at how it's been impacting their employee base. So this story is from also July 27th. Anheuser-Busch to lay off hundreds of workers amid slumping sales of Bud Light. AB is laying off hundreds of employees as it grapples with months of slumping sales for Bud Light. In a statement, AB said it's eliminating close to 2% of workers across every corporate function. That represents about 380 of AB InBev's roughly 19,000 employees. So if we take a look at what employees were impacted, it says the layoffs will not impact brewery workers, drivers, field salesmen, or warehouse staff, the company said. And that may be the case for now. But when you talk about such a precipitous decline in sales and revenue, unless that starts to pick up, these cuts are going to start happening elsewhere. And there is another story that we covered on the channel where it talked about just how these decisions that Bud Light made has been impacting folks at the distributor level who typically don't have like these executive level incomes, and it really puts a bite on their family budgets. And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy that AB said that they are going to be working towards trying to make those people whole and helping out the distributors, but at the end of the day, again, it's always the workers that are paying the price for these somewhat misguided executive decisions, and it's frustrating. Now, let's try and end on a little bit of a high note. And again, I don't think that this is something that you're probably going to see a lot of. And I certainly didn't hear about it until I started looking around and researching it. But this article is from America Insider. Look what's happening to laid off workers from Bud Light. Anheuser-Busch, the parent company of Bud Light, announced it has begun significant layoffs Following the nationwide backlash and boycotts against the company, the beer company has said it's laid off roughly 350 workers. It's unclear if more layoffs are coming, But it appears that former Bud Light employees are finding work at self-described pro-American companies. Public Square and Red Balloon are the two organizations swooping in to scoop off recently laid off AB workers, of which there were many. And then this article, granted, talks about woke politics and things of that nature. And, those terms I feel like are a little on the more incendiary side. So I don't, I feel like just as much as that first article slanted stuff in one direction, things like this can slant it in the other. But it's a great example of how companies that are looking for talent, companies that are looking for employees who may have been burnt by getting caught up in these just ideological wars that don't need to be fought at the corporate and at the brand level, can find that talent and bring them into their own company. And it starts raising all sorts of questions about, the neutrality of business. And do we need to get back to a place where brands don't have to take big stands on what's going on in just social aspects of life? It's important to make sure that brands kind of represent everybody, but by going loud and going strong in one group and insulting another group, ultimately that's got to impact the bottom line, and ultimately that impacts workers, and ultimately that hurts everybody in the economy. So there's an interesting little rundown. Boy, we went from this isn't impacting us at all to, oh my God, massive sales drop off, to let's start doing layoffs. There's a lot going on in this story. Hopefully it stabilizes soon, and hopefully there are some interesting lessons learned from this. So what are your thoughts? Let's hear about them. Put them in the comment section below. Have you been impacted by policies within your own company? What's your stance on some of these issues? We'd love to hear about it. We'd also love for you to come back. We'd love for you to spread the word about the channel if you like what you saw. So ring that bell, click subscribe, click like, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks so much for your support, and have an amazing week. Take care.